Hi everyone, just to say we're going to start in about 60 seconds. Just going to give another 60 seconds for the stragglers to come in. It's lovely to see you all, people from all over the world already into the chat, giving their weather reports. This is my favorite thing about international webinars. I just basically use it as my replacement for AccuWeather for the moment, get people to do that. So it's great to be joined by people at either end of the day as well. We're here in Ireland, we're coming to the afternoon, but I know we're joined by lots of folks I can see initially from Canada, certainly, and I'm sure there are others in the room, so that's brilliant too. So we might just get on the way. Just to introduce myself, my name is Darragh Ryder. I'm the CEO of AHEAD. So AHEAD is an Irish independent NGO which is focused on creating inclusive environments in education and employment for people with disabilities. So we'd be very big on promoting a universal design approach to education, and very much assistive tech access would be kind of central to that, coupled with our digital accessibility practices, our really engaging pedagogies. So all of those we would see as key enablers to the inclusion of people with disabilities. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I begin. If you would like to access captions, you can do so by pressing the three dots at the top right of the Teams window. And there's a little piece under language there, which allows you to turn on live captions. If English is not your first language, you can also, once the captions are available, use the three dots to the right-hand side of the captions window to change the language, so you can get live auto-translated captions, to some degree of quality, or at least which maybe help you to understand the session better and to keep track and maybe reduce that cognitive load for you. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and gently interrupting our presenter here today, so feel free to post your comments or questions in there and use it to share dialogue, to share relevant links if you wish. That would be absolutely fantastic. The more engagement in there, the better. So just before we get into our presentation today, just a little bit of scene setting. Is that here in Ireland, the demographics of our further and higher education systems are rapidly changing. Obviously, I come from it from a disability perspective, so just to share some insights there. Now, within the academic year for 2021-22, there was a equal access survey shared amongst the higher education student population, of which about 3/4 of the population take it. And within that survey, almost 18% self-reported a disability. So almost 1 in 5 self-reported a disability within that. We know from our own research in AHEAD that the numbers registered with HE support services have risen 268% in the last 12 years of available data alone. So it's this massive increase and massive change in the demographics of our higher education system. Our data in FET is perhaps a little bit less reliable, but certainly the trends are heading in the same direction. We also have this commitment right across our policy initiatives to increase the numbers of students with disabilities, both in the main FET strategy, where they're named as a priority cohort, in our National Access Plan for Higher Education, where they're named as a priority cohort. And then within the topic that we're discussing today, which is around assistive technologies, we have quite clear commitments in our policy frameworks to increasing access to assistive and educational technologies. So a good example of that, for example, is the recently released Adult Literacy for Life strategy, which under the universal design approach has this technology strand, which really highlights the availability of assistive technology as key. And within that piece, it's important to remember the rapid change that happened during COVID too, because our own research shows this huge increase amongst the disabled student cohort of assistive technology. So we had a survey data which was taken in 2020, 2021, and 2022, so 3 benchmark questions, and we saw that self-reported increase from 26% of the disabled student population highlighting AT use up to 40% in 2021, and now soon to be published data from 2022, that's already risen to 53%. So we're seeing this massive increase, which seems to have been supercharged by COVID. But I suppose just when we thought we were done a little while with mass disruption, along comes our AI tools and really throws us all up in the air again and makes us reconsider and reassess what we're doing as well. And I suppose that's difficult for us all, but it's also welcome in other ways. And with that, I hope we have somebody who can really help us to unpick these topics and unpick in particular the relationship between AI and assistive technology. So I'm delighted to welcome Brenda McDermott. And Brenda is part of an interdisciplinary research team at the University of Calgary, which is examining ethics and the ethics of generative AI tools. But she also comes from an accessibility background in terms of her work as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Brenda.
Thanks so much, Tara, for that introduction and for setting the stage so well. Before we go into the presentation, I do want to follow up. In Canada, we have a commitment to truth and reconciliation, and I'd like to take a moment just to do a land acknowledgement. So it's a way of understanding and reaffirming the importance of the land in which we live, work, and play. And for myself, being situated in Canada, it's a way of acknowledging the traditional territories that I'm situated on and that I've benefited from as a settler. So I'd like to take that moment to recognize the territory of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. And this helps us start the presentation, as we would say in Canada, in a good way. Dara recognized and noted that I am part of this interdisciplinary team. And just a shout out to my colleagues. So Robert Brennan, Jason Weens, Sarah Eaton, as well as a variety of research assistants and project managers. If you're interested in seeing what we're currently doing at the University of Calgary, you're welcome to click on that link and sort of see what our projects and publications are coming out of here. But for our conversation today, I really want to start off with challenging what's kind of a panic narrative that's come out around AI and recognizing where it may be distracting us from some other good work that we want to do. I want to unpack this notion of assisted technology, and you'll see I'll often use it in quotation marks here as a way of kind of recognizing some challenges in which all technology is assistive, so labeling it a particular way. And then I want to kind of leave it with you a little bit in terms of how, as a post-secondary sector, can we challenge AI companies to perhaps create the best products for our students so they can be successful learners. In case you're not familiar with generative artificial intelligence, I want to give you a bit of a definition. So generative artificial intelligence works in a way that is a machine learning program. Typically, this is an algorithm that you put in a prompt and it can generate output based on predictions on past training. So it's not a creative process in itself. Often it's looking at, this is the prompt that you've given it, and based on this, I can predict from my previous data what would be the response. So typically we've seen this a lot in the cases of Chat GPT or natural language processing, but there are other ways in which it's also come through in terms of looking at DALL-E and image generation, and a variety of other tools have kind of peeked through. And one way of kind of situating the panic, we talked about at the introduction, Dara mentioned this idea of post-COVID, and we thought we were done with change. Well, now we have this other rapid change, the change of AI. And Wiserman, in writing for the higher ed market, sort of talked about it as a new plague, but not in a plague as in a negative way, but as a destabilizing force that can actually challenge us as teaching and learning experts to think about, how do we teach all of those great advances that we made? But it requires us to go back and engage with the technology rather than being fearful of it. And this is not the first time we've had new technologies that have destabilized what teaching and learning means. It's just, perhaps maybe we're tired, perhaps it's doing it in a new way, but there have been many tools that have come through the history of education that allow us similar cognitive offloading as artificial intelligence tools. So thinking about, how have notebooks, the questions of literacy were challenged in terms of destabilizing what is knowledge and what skills students need to do. Calculators and even just information communication technologies have all played this destabilizing role, and really, as a result, helped shape and change the way in which we educate students. And as Dara mentioned, the demographics of students coming into post-secondary have changed. In some ways, these tools have aided and helped open up these areas to new students and learners who maybe previously couldn't participate. At the same time, though, we're seeing a restriction tense. So there's a way in which, one way to deal with AI has been to restrict, eliminate, and create these tighter, more restrictive learning environments. I think of this as our response to online learning. We had this big push for online proctoring. And I'd like to just brief message of caution here, because when we go to these more restrictive learning environments, we're actually creating additional barriers for diverse learners that didn't exist before. And as a result, with these new restrictions, we actually disproportionately impact diverse learners. And by diverse learners, that includes learners who identify as disabled, but also a variety of other marginalized groups, whether that be on race, gender, first and family to education. So, for example, with the online proctoring, there were a number of students who had difficulty using the system because it was not properly calibrated for non-white faces. Similarly, there were others who didn't have the privilege of having a private space to write the test, and so they were being flagged for potential misconduct when family members' children were walking behind them. So some of, I think, the ways we can learn from these previous educational crises, we could say, is recognizing that it's going to change the way we teach and learn, but we need to be really cognizant about how we're engaging in that, particularly for the diversity of learners that we have. You may not know that you're familiar with assistive technology, but we all use technology and all technologies assist us. When we look at in a post-secondary sector, the notion of assistive technologies, we add that assistive and it's a little bit a way of saying, well, this technology is normalized. So I have a picture of a set of glasses here. We would never go into a class and say, oh, you're wearing glasses, you have assistive technology, but it is technology and it assists you to see the screen. So really it's when we talk about assistive technology, that assistive adjective is very much used as a way to highlight these are non-normative. We have not planned for these technologies, that they're somehow associated with a gap or difference in the learner. So I like to put that's my quotation marks around it here. And one of the things that we often see with new technologies or being integrated is what typically everyone was allowed to use, what would have just been learning technology, all of a sudden gets relabeled as assistive technology. So I'm thinking in this way, if we're worried about AI algorithmic writing tools where everyone was okay to let the people use Word, we may now restrict that out of fear that students will use it inappropriately. The challenge being then is then for a student who necessarily needs Word, they now have to go through a process of identifying themselves as disabled and proving their worthiness to use this technology. So often what we see is when there's a general restriction of the learning environment, new commonplace technologies, whether it would have been a calculator or word processor, get relabeled as assistive technologies so that a subset of students have to self-identify as disabled and needing it moving forward. And many common technologies that you've already used integrate AI. And I wanted to highlight some of them in case you were thinking this is a sort of a black box, but looking at the captioning and transcription tools that are involved in this webinar in itself is an example of AI in terms of being able to translate using natural language processing to be able to put down the ideas that I'm speaking to you here. If you've ever seen a word prediction function, in any of you're writing an email or you're writing a text, those are already the fundamental pieces of a lot of the generative AI that we're talking about. And if you're like me and you love advanced proofreading tools that are able to be what seem a little bit smarter, but can actually parse the context of your sentence, things like Grammarly, these are already the first steps in natural language processing AI being part of your everyday life. We'll see some continuations and developments, but in particular in the teaching and learning context, we're already starting to see AI emerging into things like grading and feedback programs for students. I'm thinking of things like GradeScope. We're starting to see the emergence of chatbot learning assistants or teaching assistants, where students can go and in real time connect and find different ways of understanding content. And already with some of the early integration with Microsoft Outlook, we're starting to see new text summaries. And even in my PowerPoint, I'm having a much better job of it doing auto descriptions of my images. Where I want us to take away in some of the learning that, and why I brought up the topic of assistive technology, is assistive technology is often the counterpoint to the panic narrative around artificial intelligence. So typically on the other end of the panic is sort of this moral virtue signaling. about how these technologies are going to benefit individuals' disabilities. These are going to be tools that allow them to increase their participation within the educational sector and employment. And while I'm not going to say that those are untrue, those virtual signalings, traditionally what has happened is we haven't had the same follow through. So we get sold kind of a lot of promise and that it will be used for particular groups of diverse learners. But then, as I'm going to describe for you, we're going to see that they become a whole bunch of limitations of actually making this fulfilled and real for learners. And as a result, what tends to happen is it tends to be a tool used by the dominant, the majority, and it never quite meets its promise. So two of the tools I'm going to talk to you a little bit about are quite commonplace now. So one is reading technology, so screen reading, and the other one I'm going to talk to you about is dictation. I'm going to highlight a little bit about how these tools haven't quite reached their potential. And part of this is tied to the way in which they've been built and developed and operationalized. So if you were requiring a screen reader along the way, what you'll often find is there's a lack of interoperability. So, it might work within one program or one sort of Windows or desktop setting, but now you're using a different tool. You have to do a different screen reader, a different dictation software. To get it to work well for you, if you have a non-dominant voice, takes a lot of work and effort. And when we look at, the development and training of it, we often see that, this was not the focus of the training or development. Dara, I see you've popped up. Do we have a question?
Yeah, no, it's kind of a comment, just have a little question. I'm just wondering if you could maybe give me your thoughts on it. You mentioned about the sort of concept of these technologies becoming assistive by nature of the restriction that begins to be put around other thing, and in a way it's forcing people to do what can be stigmatizing behaviors, like having to go and register with services, things like that. I'm just wondering, it just reminds me of some of the response that we're seeing to Chat GPT being very much to take a hard turn back towards in-person assessments and in particular in-person exams, which we in the head would, our general research would point to, being riddled with disadvantage for a whole cohort of students, and that the reasonable accommodations that are typically offered in those settings are largely piecemeal things that it's debatable the impact that they have in leveling the playing field. So there's already this kind of academic integrity issue wrapped up in that. I just wondered, is that something you had any reflections on in terms of how your thoughts align there with the piece you just mentioned?
I think a lot of that restriction, and I think the most restrictive environment for assessment that we ask of students are in-person timed exams. So I could say that's probably one of the most highly restricted spaces where I would describe it as a little bit of policing the body in many ways, because we're requiring you to sit in a certain space, perform certain behaviors and emotional controls. And so, yeah, the more we make those environments restrictive, the more for individuals to succeed, they have to then attach what's been traditionally a stigmatized identity with them. So I think that's quite concerning reaction to new technologies, and sadly not necessarily a new one, right? As technology improved with ICT, there's all of a sudden increased restriction on calculators, as if somehow the calculator would become a tool to bring in the ICT technology into the classroom. So we start seeing those trends over and over again.
Yeah, what we're seeing in our work is the whole issue around recording and access to that. And it's funny, we come into a setting like this where it's just full of educators and we're getting asked for the recording right from the beginning of the session. And yet we still have huge difficulty getting that mandated as a kind of a standard piece, and we are often forcing our students to disclose just to get access to that. So sorry, I'll let you get back on track. There's some really nice comments coming up in the chat around agreeing with your general approach around assistive technologies in terms of the labeling. As in all the technologies are assistive, so it's something you're getting a lot of agreement in the chat from here.
Perfect. So let me take a look into some of those ones that you might not have realized were assistive technologies, and I'm going to look at them a little bit in the lines of who speaks, so who do we hear, and then who is listened to. And when we look at reading tools, I wanted to highlight just within even the English language tools, some of the diversity of voices you do hear. and also thinking about some of them that you don't. So for example, if we were to look at Microsoft Edge, which has a fairly substantive integrated tool for reading, you'll have an option of choosing a variety of voices. But the variety of voices that you're given access to are often tied to what are often called kind of core or central English language countries. So if we look at the options for the United Kingdom, they are the most plentiful. And there are other areas where you would not have voices from there. So if I'm thinking about, we're looking at Caribbean nations, it's much more challenging to find voices for that. If we have colleagues from Scotland, very difficult to find voices that will read to you in a Scottish accent going forward. And so this is just part of an idea here, is that even when we think about assistive technologies, the assistive technologies themselves still focus on kind of that normative voice. And while it may seem like a minor issue to have something that is tied to questions of voices, you might wonder, why does that matter? Well, it creates a bigger cognitive load for the learner, right? So if we're trying to listen to someone with a different accent, it's not that it's impossible or difficult, but it does take a little bit longer. And I notice in the chat, people are talking about there are some fabulous tools that have a wide range of voices. However, those tend to not be the built-in free tools. So if I do need something more like an accented English of a particular kind, I might be able to find a tool that will do that as a screen reader or allow me to download or add it in. But I may be looking at an additional cost compared to the built-in free ones. The other thing I wanted to note too is that even in some of the options here, when we look at some of the varieties here, you won't have the same level of choices. So on the right-hand side, I have a chart here that talks about, English Australian, English Canada, and it gives us the names of the voices. And you'll notice in some accents, you don't actually you get a choice of multiple male, multiple female. However, in the case of Ireland, built into Windows 10, we have no female voices allowed. So in that case, we can already see that for the diversity of learners who need this tool, it hasn't actually met that equity lens yet in terms of the technology. It gets a little bit more problematic when we start thinking about the actual dictation tools. So those are the tools that I would speak, and it would provide text of what I've been speaking. You might have noticed this too in some of the captions on different webinars along the way, that for certain voices are privileged and are able to be quite quickly translated, and other ones, it doesn't do as good a job. And so if you were to use the automatic voice recognition system in a Windows 10 system, you might get some of these error messages. So the first one is your microphone's not on, but the other one is that voice typing isn't available in your current language. So if it's not able to listen to you, it'll just pretend that you don't have a supported language. And I listed the supported languages on the side as a way of a tool to look at what were the languages supported. In this case, we're looking at accents. Not all accents, especially non-dominant English countries, are listed there. So this gives us a little sense of what were the priorities of the makers of this technology. Who were they anticipating as their users, and who were excluded? And when we think about this as assistive technology, we do see that this is particularly challenging for non-dominant users who have different intonation patterns. They won't be picked up here. It won't meet that support. And there are always workarounds, because I work in accessibility. So I know that we make things work for students, but when we make them work, it's again another sign of we didn't anticipate you, you don't belong. And you're going to have to put more time and effort into making a tool work than, again, someone who's coming from a dominant perspective. So what I'd like to kind of do, if we think about artificial intelligence, is can we move away from this dichotomy of it being something that we praise or we panic about, And can we actually engage with generative AI and the programs and the developers as a group of post-secondary countries and say, we want a tool that works well for all learners? There's some, this is some ways the pressure that's often been put on learning management systems and their increase in the pandemic to allow for greater assistive technology built in was a push by post-secondaries who are purchasing and these technologies to be able to go and develop this. So really what I'm trying to do is say, like, the question we often right now ask about artificial intelligence is, should students use it? Should they access it? I'd like to reframe that a little bit to go, how can we push beyond can people access it? So really think about, are these tools usable for all students? Do they meet the needs of all learners? And what role can we play as post-secondaries as challenging companies who perhaps haven't done sufficient training for marginalized groups, haven't done enough user work on these groups? So some of the things that I would say, if we want to reshape the conversation and start to move, and this is where I'd like to open it up for some discussion amongst the group here, is can we reframe it in terms of social justice lens? So thinking less about equal access and more about equality of access and using. And can we challenge along the lines of creating a fair generative AI? So this requires us as educators to understand that AI is a great tool for machine learning about the current state. And as such, it learns about our current biases and our current practices. But it's quite challenging from an AI algorithmic perspective to really think about, how do we make an algorithm for fairness? And some of that thinking about an algorithmic fairness may actually challenge the efficacy of certain educational practices. How can we push forward for more minority experiences, both in terms of training, but also in terms of user experiences, so we don't have these same user gaps? As well as, is there a way of even pushing diversity into these teams? And then the last one is maybe thinking a little bit about, what does generative AI learn? And maybe thinking about the lines of what is the standard English that it's learned? So when we look at something like OpenAI and other tools, they have large data sets that they train on. These data sets tend to not use copyrighted material because that would be expensive. It also means that it's getting trained in a particular standard English that may not reflect other ways of speaking and being. For me, this as a Canadian, it's always interesting because there's always that slight difference from our neighbor down south in the US. But this may be felt more prominently in India, in Singapore, in Ireland, where we start to see different ways of speaking, different ways of spelling, different phrasing that won't be generated under the predictive model of OpenAI because it hasn't been trained on that. So, what does that mean? Is this a tool that allows for people to actually express themselves in the way in which they sound? Are we going to lose markers of identity? I'd like just to take a little pause here, Dara. Are there any questions? Are there any thoughts that the audience wanted to share on this?
Yeah, there's loads of really interesting comments in the chat. One is coming in there from Mairead, and basically she's talking about, amongst all this talk of the dangers about generative AI and that it is originally trained, but presumably, obviously, these tools they can be retrained and we can get involved in the training pieces. So having these types of conversations is very important, and it's really important for educators and researchers across the board to be getting involved. So have you any ideas, Brenda, about how that dialogue can happen between the creators of these tools and I suppose sectors, especially sectors like education, which are so drastically impacted by the introduction of it?
I think perhaps, we're on Teams here. We're on a Microsoft product. We know Microsoft has the idea um, of integrating more open AI into their tools and projects. So, as a big consumer market, there may be some potential there for some pushback or for some ways of actually going back here and and doing a little bit of like, does this work? Can we require this as a consumer base? I mean, one of the challenges traditionally associated with assistive technology has been the notion of it's a small market, right? So it's not profitable. Therefore, to make it profitable, we need to go mainstream. This can be a point, I think, of challenge in terms of the people who are buying the educational tools, who, you know, we're signing contracts with these large software companies, whether it be Microsoft or Google. This could be a push and something that we require from them rather than letting them share this with us piece by piece.
Can I ask, I mean, I suppose we focus a lot, especially during this AI week with QQI, which has been fascinating. I've actually been in every session this week, so I'm sort of a QQI fanboy this week. But I'm just wondering, there's a huge amount of discussion in or around the sort of the negativity and the moral panic, I suppose, that's out there is kind of driving a lot of fear-based stuff going on, fear-based conversations. And obviously there is real fears, as you've highlighted right there. But what about the promise of AI for inclusion? Do you see interesting use cases? And this is something maybe I'd love to open out to the floor more generally. If you'd either like to pop it into the chat or even come on, if you want to raise your hand, we can open up the camera or microphone for you and like to come on and share some ideas about the promise of AI for where it can take us from an inclusion perspective as well. Because we know all of these things have pros and cons, negatives. Every technology tool, none of them are neutral. They all have these effects on both sides of the fence. So do you see big leaps forward in inclusion as well as potential for leaps backwards as well?
My first concern is always, do we leap back by restricting the education environment that has worked so well for that we're just starting to open up? So that's always my first concern is, will the panic make us lock things down? Like I think of myself as a learner with a disability around writing, and if everything I had to do was handwritten again, I would be seeking tons of accommodation, but I live in a world of computers, so I don't need that. But I that's the first thing that kind of comes to mind. The other thing that I think um, push forward, I mean, I think the cognitive offloading can be very helpful, especially if we take a trauma-informed lens to education. So if we recognize we have cohorts of students who've just come out of pandemic, we have great deals of mental health challenges. All of this affects executive function. So the parts that help us concentrate, maintain attention, working memory span. This tool could be very helpful for helping students, you know, be able to maintain concentration, be able to access things in different ways of expression. But where we perhaps haven't gotten there is the quality control piece. Uh, it's it's very good at some things. You know, if you ask for an email, for some of those levels of kind of just interaction conversation. But I think that the challenge will be right now, it's not accurate enough unless we do some training. And then that's the kind of work. If I can give it, you know, 2 or 3 shot learning, give it some data, then it can provide me a better summary along the way. And I think that can be helpful, right? You know, I think of my own grad school of how many pages of reading were there. And wouldn't, you know, we all learned these short checks because, you know, no one could read, you know, 500 pages a week. There may be a way of helping students to do that moving forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting things with Chat GPT-4, as you know, is that it allows for image input. And from the examples shared, although image input isn't widely available yet, from the examples that we have seen shared, and as you say, Brenda, sometimes the promise of these doesn't quite live up to the reality, but we're seeing from the examples that it looks like that it's actually very good at image description, which I think is actually for a very marginalized community in the visually impaired community, a really welcome benefit that if built into mainstream technologies could be quite a significant step forward for them. And we're seeing another really good example shared by Perry in the chat as something that possibly could happen. You mentioned the piece around voice and how important that is in giving voice to yourself if you're using these types of text-to-speech technologies. Perry was referencing a tool called DID, it's basically a deep fake tool. It's a tool for creating for creating video from still images and voice samples. And I've actually played with this myself, and I was sharing in the chat there. I have created a video. I was just trying to learn to use these tools, but where I have my dad saying a whole bunch of stuff that he would never say, using a voice note to train it. And obviously, look, that again is massively problematic in a lots of different ways. But potentially, is that something where you could see is actually having positive impacts from the point of view of that voice piece that we're talking about?
I think there is definitely some positive pieces here. I think it highlights, though, the importance of not restricting this technology, but really teaching students how to use it and what does it mean. And I always think about, too, going forward, if students are going to be the ones in those businesses, wouldn't it be great if we could provide them with a bit more AI literacy skills so that they're actually able to unpack, and when someone talks about a tool, that they're able to ask, okay, what were the data sets that you were trained on? How did you determine this? So being able to actually go and ask really good questions so that they can be critical consumers. And then at the same time, it'll allow people too on the other end who are using it to create an identity that maybe reflects themselves, or allow them to interact in society in a way that they haven't been able to. But then can we make sure it's a full force of it? I think a little bit about how often, these tools do only have the voices of the majority. And I think of, the great Stephen Hawking and how quickly that voice became his identity. But at first it didn't match him, right? It's American accent for a UK scholar. So those pieces too of how often do we ask people to use a voice that doesn't reflect their own?
A really interesting question here from Anne Gagnon. Hi Anne, how's it going? I would have interacted with you on Twitter plenty of times in the past, so it's good to see you in the chat room. So Anne's question is really about what you think about this idea of the for all narrative, so for all in quotation marks. So from the point of view that there's always going to be someone that needs a specific tool that's adaptable to their specific lived experience. So how do we frame this so it's more inclusive? I suppose is this where AI can support further and find something specific for them without having to, perhaps label them in a particular way?
I think there's some potential. I mean, there's always, especially for learners with disabilities, we tend to use that as an encompassing. But when we think about the variety of people who are in there and their intersectionalities with other identities, you start to realize like this is a very heterogeneous group, right? So there's a lot of variation amongst it. Uh, but I can see there's some potential for easy customization, right? Like so, but that requires a better user interface going through, right? And the other way, I think I see Lillian's made a comment of this. When we think about universal design for learning, that is an approach that comes out of universal design, which comes out of, if there are unexpected benefits for a large group of people when we start to think about, you know, the needs of individuals with disabilities, so curb cut effects and things like that. So, rather than just thinking of it perhaps as, we'll never meet all the needs of all the learners, but starting to think along that lines actually helps us to incorporate large bodies of people who perhaps didn't know that that was something they needed or would benefit from. So I think of, when we move to online education, how many people with family commitments, how many people who had limited financial resources were able to now work an extra shift or the more lucrative shift because they had the recording, or perhaps maybe just even those who maybe had a bad day, or the child was up late at night. Now I can't concentrate. So when we start thinking about designing for individuals with disabilities, we hit a large group of people who find that they use it. And I think that's why these tools of speech to text or text to speech are so common now. They were functionally started off as a sort of a disability problem in terms of that. But now many people use them during the pandemic as just part of their ways of learning. So I think that's the benefit of attempting at for all tools. We might not achieve it, but we'll be able to push great bounds that way.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's kind of the direction of travel with most technology tools, isn't it? That most of what would be originally assistive tools is that over time, almost all of them in some way or another become part of the sort of mainstream technology conversation. So there's a question here from Liam who's talking about I suppose the proliferation of these new numerous tools, these new different generative AI tools, that would be really considered to be going beyond the assistive, as he's saying, with like Chat GPT 4, etc. So what is the possible policy? And this is $1 million question, which I'm sure you'll only be able to skim the surface of, Brendan, because everybody's scrapping with this right now. What is the policy for usage of it in an academic sector, focusing on higher education, which is kind of reasonable in that sort of sphere?
The first thing that comes to mind is the idea a little bit about curation. And I think about when when you do a literature review, you're curating, you're making connections between different articles and pieces, and that's something that the current AI is not able to do very well. So there's still this active of what's important, doing better structures into the paper. So I'm wondering if what we're really doing is, in terms of a policy, is it emphasizing the role of the curation? So can the student articulate, what did I do? Okay, it wrote these two sentences, but I had to evaluate the sentences. I had to adjust for the quality of the writing, and the correctness of it. So is there a way of kind of defining authorship? And this is where some interesting work come out of some of my colleagues at the University of Calgary around Indigenous ways of academic integrity, which again moves to a more reciprocal way of understanding academic integrity, dealing with more ideas of shared knowledge rather than knowledge as being attributed to one individual. So I'm thinking those may be some guidelines for us in terms of policy, is sort of and so the work of people like Kita Gladu, in collaboration with Sarah and Eaton at the University of Calgary here, and looking at, what are different ways of even defining authorship. And this wouldn't be the first time we've had to redefine authorship, just maybe in Western academic culture, but it has happened in music and in art where we had things like remix and sampling, and people had to grapple with, well, what does that mean in terms of who is the owner of that song?
Yeah, we went in our preparatory conversation for this. We went from talking about this as a Napster style moment, where there is that sort of tendency for the big players to shut down or try and shut down the issue rather than trying to work with it and seeing how we can work to embed it ethically and meaningfully in the sector. So we've gone from Napster to remixing, which I really love that analogy. Yeah, so there's a really interesting question from Perry there in the chat. That's something it's been said that tools like ChatGPT and Light Grammy kind of raise the bar for writing to such a kind of extent that it's perfect text is now becoming the standard and the basic expectation. And he's just wondering if you have any thoughts on what the implications are of that for diverse learners, and that, are we creating a sort of a sense of a perfect communication being a standard?
And this is one where I'm of two minds. So from thinking of it in lenses of identity, the idea of perfect language makes me wonder, like, do we lose linguistic diversity? I wonder about, questions of linguistic imperialism coming through. But at the same time, it allows people to move through spaces without being identified as others. So it's a way of, if you typical language acquisition, like, so if I'm a second language speaker of English, some of those errors can be hidden now or corrected in a way that so that I don't need to be identified as different in that function. For individuals with challenges around communication, so our neurodiverse group, does it help me engage in a way in written communication where I may have previously struggled because I would have had difficulty in maybe putting myself in the mind of the other when I was writing. So I think there's some real potentials of allowing people to move through spaces without having to be othered. I just don't know if, from an identity perspective, if that should be what we're doing rather than embracing it. And that's why I think there's some really interesting work on kind of the idea of what is standardized English, um, and how does it vary. amongst different areas of the country, or just even different minority groups within. And it kind of leads us back to that question of accent, versus, okay, so is this even within Ireland? I'm sure there are a variety of different accents, same within the southern United States versus others, or more urban African American groups. So it's like, well, we could make everyone sound the same at least in terms of writing, but should we, is the question that I always kind of wonder.
Yeah, as I have the captions up here in front of me as we're talking, and it's definitely more accurate with your accent than mine. My Dublin accent, even just watching it. So that's a good example there. There's two questions sort of related here about the dangers of becoming reliant on generative AI as a population. And one was from Nicola asking about, is there will the over reliance actually help us to stop examining the demonstration of learning, how will we actually really get under the hood of that? And then Sue has asked, is there a potential danger that we actually constrain innovative and creative thinking because we're relying so much on this AI that's trained on a very specific data set over time?
There's some interesting work that was done earlier on Google algorithms, and I'm thinking of the Black Hands project in particular, where if we feed new data in, we can get different results. So part of it, that project was just to have individuals put up pictures of non-white hands on their websites, so that when they did the image search of Google, instead of it all being white hands, there was a greater variety. So if we're looking at this as a machine learning tool, there are ways in which we could start to think about resisting the machine for that creativity piece. So I'm not as worried about the creativity if we continue to think really creatively about how can we push back on the tool, and with the multi-shot learning pieces. I'm also, I guess, less concerned about the reliance, particularly for generative AI writing, because most of the errors that we identify in writing, and as being sort of non-standard, do not impact our ability to understand what the person is saying. Right. So if I have an agreement error, I use the wrong article, typically you'll still get the gist of what I'm trying to communicate. So even if the tool wasn't there. Um, and there are just it's part of, I think, a shaping of a relationship to knowledge, and where knowledge is kept, and moving it away from the mind. And I think we've already seen that with, you could ask Google the question. I think there's an old John Fillmore sketch from the BBC where he talks about this kills all of the pub conversations, because now you just go on your phone and you look up what is the largest city in this country. We've already moved to that, right? We don't sit and ponder, does anyone recall this? We go to our phone, or we just say, hey, Google, and go from there.
Totally. I think Lillian has kind of put her own response in the chat saying that it's like the reliance on calculators, that like the people would struggle much more perhaps with mental arithmetic now, but that's never to say we would ever want to go back to having to do that, and it would take us a step back. Patrick's joke that there may be a bigger danger of enhancing creative and imaginative thinking and learning, which is a lovely response to it there. Ian has mentioned here in the commentary, actually, really interestingly, that OpenAI, in terms of the image input and the analysis that we referenced there on Chat GPT 4, that's not yet available publicly, but it's actually only been made available to Be My Eyes, which is a project that they're doing jointly with visually impaired people to have to look at to see how that technology can be integrated into the Be My Eyes technology as well. So that's interesting. At least they're trying to reach out to other diverse groups to get them involved at this stage. Sierra's just mentioned about the banning of AI in schools, which is, seems to be something that's on in the conversation, and that will really, a bit like you said, Brenda, about when we restrict technologies that it's most harmful to our disadvantaged communities, that's going to have the biggest impact on minorities whose family can't afford the kind of mainstream AI tech at home. So totally agree with that approach.
And I think that's a good highlighting point even now for a lot of the AI tools that are available, is that there is a fee available to it, right? Like, this is not all free. If you're using the free version, you might be stuck in that waiting room of it's busy right now. So it does, the sort of being able to pay for play options really do come into that, versus if we look at integrating this as a learning tool.
And can I ask them a little bit about, so there's one or two comments in the chat about the concern around um the concern I suppose around that this might actually damage literacy in the long run in terms of the over reliance on the tool might have damage literacy in some instances. I mean, we know the research is very strong on challenge being a very important factor in learning. Really, it's only when we face challenge. I suppose as proponents of UD and UDL, we're always talking about that balance between we want to reduce access to the challenge, not the challenge itself. So have you any kind of sense of where the line is in this conversation about how can we allow our students to use tools like Chat GPT to reduce barriers to the challenge without actually reducing the challenge itself too much?
And I guess it's I'm looking at the current state. I mean, the future state may actually make this as it gets more systematic and advanced, but it isn't a very good student in terms of the quality of the work. So we could look at this if this is the baseline that students are produced, can we actually get them to move away from that knowledge, the lower levels of the Bloom taxonomy, and actually like make them engage in synthesis and evaluation and reflection to their own lived context and how they would use it. So is this a way of, if it's no longer, can you just tell me what Plato says? Can I move it now to, tell me how Plato will help you discuss, this unique situation or context. But that's where I think the destabilizing force is most felt, I think, in the way we assess, and that's where we're concerning. So it's kind of challenging our assessment models after a whole range of online learning challenged us before. But really, yeah, as I see someone here, yeah, do we move into that critical thinking? Do we get them to evaluate the quality that's coming out of Chat GPT or other tools and take them to the next level? Right. So it's even if you're, and there's a skill in, okay, how did your prompt impact the results? Why did that word have a bigger impact than another word? What does that tell you about how the way you express your ideas impacts the cognition of the tool? So there's some very creative ways of doing it, but in a context where we're often looking for efficiency in assessments, I'm not sure if, because we've lots of students, we need to get through lots of things. That's where that tension is versus that much more reciprocal, relational, and learning as an engagement with myself and my position in the world. And so that's a tension that I cannot solve. Otherwise, I think I'd be the president of some university if I was able to solve that.
Apologies, Brenda. It seems that Dara has dropped temporarily out, but I think maybe a few people might have a few more comments in the chat and hopefully be back with us in a minute.
Yeah. There's some really great comments in the chat, and I just want to acknowledge that I really appreciate that because it's developing my own learning in this area as we go forward. But hopefully we can think about, how do we make the best AI tool for all of our learners rather than worrying about the AI tool in itself. I know there's always questions about, how does this impact what's considered fundamental skills. So I'd be interested to see from this group's perspective, is that a concern? Are we worried that we'll lose our ability to write if we rely on these kind of technologies? I'd look forward to your comments in the chat or hear a voice.
Hi there. Hi, Brenda. This is Sue from QQI. I just wanted to say in relation to that I do think there is an issue if you use, a lot of my colleagues have been talking about using AI generated text for teaching academic writing, for example. And you can see how that can be helpful. You definitely, so deconstructing, analyzing, understanding more around structure, all that sort of thing. However, there is also that balance between looking at it from that point of view and also being able to ensuring that you're not telling the writer that they have to conform to what has come out from a large language model, effectively. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I'm probably saying it in a rather too long-winded way.
I think I'm hearing, we can use it as a teaching tool, but because it's so predictive, it's not, how will that impact some of the more unusual ways of expressing ourselves, or more unique ways? Is that a good summary?
Yes, exactly. And, it's that idea that we want everybody, particularly if I'm thinking of the humanities and the arts, we want everybody to develop that confidence in their own voice. We don't want them to feel they have to, we have to play to the audience, so to speak. And that brings me into assessment, where there are clear issues there, but that's maybe another conversation for another day.
Conversation always leads to assessments, Sue, when we're chatting, especially when we're chatting to you. Sorry about that, folks. I don't know if you can hear in the background, there's alarms ringing. The entire electricity in my block just went on, so I have to, I'm tethered to my mobile hotspot instead. So I just say, just to kind of bring it shortly to a close, I see some really interesting stuff in the chat there about the potential positive use cases for educators. You were just talking, as I got thrown out there, Brenda, about Plato and sort of having those conversations with Plato. And I can say there's a similar piece around Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII, etc. And maybe this opens up really interesting, positive, engaging experiences for learners that may capture learners that didn't actually, weren't engaged by some previous methodologies. So I think that's a really positive development. Certainly, as someone from the UDL side of things, I think about the load for academics, very, very busy load that they have in their work lives. And that's one of the big barriers to UDL implementation is, how do I create alternative formats how do I have the time? Potentially this could open up, for example, I've used it myself when I'm doing training sessions and creating different scenarios that I can give to different groups. And it's quite good with clear prompts, and as long as you kind of know how to engineer those prompts, you tend to get quite good examples out of that, which you can then tweak for your own. So is there anything that you see as a really helpful from the educator point of view in terms of what we can use these tools for?
I think it's interesting how those don't have quite the same panic. I just wanted to mention, like, we talk about how they help us. We don't tend to panic as much about what if the students use it. So I think it is very helpful in generating scenarios, providing some content to work with. And I think that's where that reciprocal relationship too is, and having people understand that this is not the creator. It is a predictive tool. It's based on, I fed it data. This is what it predicts. Fits that pattern. And I think that's where we can have some really interesting discussions with. So how is academic writing very formulaic and pattern driven? Who are the authors who have deviated from that pattern? Why have they deviated from that pattern? Maybe embracing that. So I think of sometimes some of the more postmodern writers who it's like, oh, I read this. I don't understand. Like, this doesn't follow the pattern. Okay, so is that a choice? So I think it actually embraces and really challenges us to think about language as a whole. What kind of language do we think what language have we valued? What we have devalued? What maybe have we spent too much time marking, such as comma splices and, misused semicolons? And have we taught students that that's what we're evaluating in language? Then I would see, yeah, use AI because it won't make that mistake. Or are we concerned more with what you're saying? And if so, what errors are we willing to overlook because you're engaging in something interesting, because you're engaging in some higher cognitive loads, and we know you won't be able to attend to those more individual details. So I'm thinking that might be that may be the challenge AI is having us think about is, have we valued or taught students in the way we've assessed them that grammatical correctness is the goal, or is this a new tool to say, look, this tool can be grammatically correct, but when I ask it to talk about certain topics, it's complete rubbish, or it's very surface level. Okay,
Yeah.
so what do we want? What's the critical thinking? And maybe help us recognize that maybe grammatical correctness and APA style and Chicago style, like because you italicized or capitalized it, is not the be all and end all of actual knowledge creation. But that means some coaching is needed for all instructors, but in particular for novice instructors, because evaluating those other ideas are much more complex and much more subjective.
Absolutely. That was thoroughly fascinating. As I've been with every webinar this week, many questions answered, many more opened up for me. I really enjoyed that, Brenda. There's been a lot of love in the room for this presentation. So I want to thank you for your time, and for QQI to inviting both of us along for this chat. I hope everyone in the room is going to check out the remaining two lunchtime webinars, one which is taking place tomorrow, which is around the National Academic Integrity Network. I think that's hosted by Perry, actually, who's in the room today as well. So that's next on your list. If you haven't signed up, get out there and register, and we'll see you all tomorrow. But thank you. Thanks a million, Brenda, and thanks to all of you who came along for enjoying the session. Take care. The recording will be over to you in due course.